Welcome. So welcome. We have a really nice program planned for you tonight. We have Ken Bernstein. You know, you've been getting a lot of things from Jolynn. She's been sending you all the stuff on it. Before I introduce Ken Bernstein, I want to talk about next month's event, which is a lot of you know this woman. She's a member of the community. She lives on Wilcox. She's a member of the tennis club. Her name is Julia Claiborne Johnson. She wrote a book, which is a bestseller all of a sudden, and it's sold at Chevalier's, by the way, and it's called Better Luck Next Time. So next month's event it's on August 25th at 7 p.m. It's a novel set at a divorce ranch in Reno in the 1930s. A book with memorable, eccentric characters, sparkling dialogue, a satisfying plot twist, and some romance and sex. A feel-good literary comedy Western. I think if you guys, I'm sure everyone here has seen the movie The Women from the 30s, where when you got divorced, you would go to Reno for a while. And apparently Julia's father was 19 years old and he was, you know, on the dude ranch. So there were all these young guys, helping these poor divorcees on these dude ranches. When she decided to write the book, her father was unfortunately had Alzheimer's, so she got a lot of the information from his brother. But it should be a good book, and it's been a bestseller. So she's going to be here next month. I just want to say a couple things. You know, we're getting ready for next year. We have got a lot of new trustees, which is nice. A lot of a new advisory board this year, doing a couple things. We have that annual roster that we put out every year. It's a little booklet, but this year we're going to do something different. We're going to do a digital version of that, so we don't have to waste paper. We're going green, and so we're doing that. I just wanted to tell you all that. And then we decided yesterday at the executive meeting we're going to have our first live event, which will be our annual meeting. We didn't have one last year, of course, because of COVID. And the one before that was the one that was at the Amundsen House on Hudson. So we are doing it, and we're aiming for August 29th. We don't have the location yet or any of the other details, but we do have, we're honoring Captain Shannon Paulson from the Wilshire Division, who is moving to another position after many years being with us here. She's going to be our honoree, and we also have a guest speaker. So who is Allison Martino of Vintage LA. She's got like 8 million followers on Facebook. If you guys are on Facebook, check out Vintage LA if you haven't already. She was a Hollywood brat. Her father was Al Martino, the singer. And she just loves everything about Los Angeles, and every post of hers is fascinating. It's restaurants that weren't there before, like Dino's on Sunset, where 77 Sunset Strip was filmed years ago. She's just got so much information, and her posts are always so colorful and big. Lots of hundreds of comments on each of her posts. So she is going to be our guest speaker, which I'm thrilled with. Now I'm going to introduce Ken Bernstein. So Ken Bernstein wrote this book. It's Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. And I was thinking of this today. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I was in Philly before I came to California when I was 22. I was in Philly when the bicentennial was on. And Philadelphia was going just crazy, restoring everything. And it was the reconstructed City Tavern, which was a historic restaurant that Washington ate in. And, you know, it was fascinating. So it was, in light of this that we're going to watch tonight, I was thinking of that today. And then I also want to tell everybody that I lived in Williamsburg, Virginia for a year, which was like living in a museum. And that was a fascinating experience. So then that's probably why I'm the president of the Historical Society in Windsor Square. So let me go on to Ken Bernstein. Ken Bernstein is a principal city planner for the Los Angeles Department of City Planning. In this capacity, he oversees the city's Office of Historic Resources, which was responsible for Los Angeles historic preservation policies and programs. He serves as lead staff member for the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, has overseen the completion of Survey LA, a multi-year citywide survey of historic resources with significant support from the J. Paul Getty Trust, and has led the city's efforts to create a comprehensive historic preservation program for Los Angeles. He currently leads the department's Urban Design Studio, which works to elevate the quality of design for private development projects and major civic investments in Los Angeles. He previously served for 8 years as Director of Preservation Issues for the Los Angeles Conservancy, and that's where I met Ken when I was active with the HPOZ for Windsor Square, which is the LA Conservancy is the largest local nonprofit historic preservation organization in the country, where he directed the Conservancy's public policy and advocacy activities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ken Bernstein. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Richard, and good evening to all of you. It's really such a pleasure to be with all of you tonight, and I'm going to try to share my screen here. That's, I hope, coming across all right. Let's see,
yes.
There we go. All right, great. Well, it's really an honor to be asked to join you with the Historical Society. I just want to thank all of you for what you do all year long to celebrate and preserve the significant history of your own community. And I know as a result, in a way, I'm kind of preaching to the choir tonight. Those of you who have this appreciation and commitment to Los Angeles history and preservation, I really decided to write this book because so many people, I think, have misunderstandings about Los Angeles and its relationship to history and preservation, that there's this often repeated myth that I really have wanted to explode through this book, that Los Angeles is a city that has little or no history or significant architecture, doesn't care about its heritage. And I think really nothing could be further from the truth. And I hope you're convinced of that by the end of the evening tonight, if you're not already, if I'm not already preaching to the choir. You know, I think I've often been frustrated as well by the way that Los Angeles is portrayed in popular culture, in other books about the city. There's this idea that the sum total of Los Angeles is our entertainment industry, kind of the Tinseltown image, La La Land image of Los Angeles. And that's really, of course, just a tiny slice of what LA is all about. And I've been very fortunate in my career that Richard outlined to have this bird's eye view of historic preservation in Los Angeles as an advocate and then administering a city preservation program, to really have an opportunity to see how preservation has been making a difference in community after community around Los Angeles. And I want to try to capture through this book the more complex and much more interesting Los Angeles that I've come to see. And what I've seen is that historic preservation, far from being about the perception of it being obstructionist and saying no and being about stopping change, that preservation really has been an engine of change throughout Los Angeles, that it's been helping to transform certainly our downtown and the tremendous revitalization of our historic core, historic downtown, Broadway and Spring Street and other adjacent streets downtown, but throughout the city, really being a tool for economic revitalization, the regeneration of communities, and even addressing some of our other policy challenges, such as affordable housing and housing supplies. And I'll get to that as we go along. And I wanted to bring that preservation story of Los Angeles to a larger audience, both to Angelenos who may not have been paying close attention to what's happening around the city, and those from outside the city who still have those misperceptions of LA. And I've been very gratified just in the few months that the book has been out that my intentions of the book have been resonating, I think, with audiences, and many people have been reaching out to me to let me know that they're seeing the city very differently as a result of getting the book and really understanding what's been happening around the city in terms of historic preservation. I hope the same will be true of all of you getting to experience the book. So I have a pretty busy job with the city of Los Angeles, and decided to kind of make this my weekend project, as I called it, for about 2 years. I've been working on this on the side, kind of chipping away at this, and it was really a labor of love for me. And in that spirit, I also decided that I wanted to donate my proceeds from the book to 3 national organizations that are working toward greater representation and inclusion in the historic preservation field: the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, that's part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Latinos in Heritage Conservation, and APIA HIP, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. All of them are really working toward greater inclusion within the preservation field itself, and inclusion and representation in terms of what gets recognized and preserved through historic preservation tools. I also knew that I wanted this not just to kind of tell my audience about historic preservation in LA, but to really have a visually compelling book that would show those skeptics and the naysayers about LA what we have, the richness of what we have in LA. And so I needed the right photographer collaborator, and was very fortunate to already know exactly the right partner for this project, Stephen Schaefer, who has been active in historic preservation himself in his home community in Ventura. He's been a board member of the California Preservation Foundation, our statewide nonprofit preservation group. And so Schaeff, I'd worked with him in the past, and he's known as Schaeff to his friends. He really approached this project not just as a commercial photographer taking on a job, but really saw all of the sites that we were trying to illustrate with a preservationist eye, and kind of intuitively understood what we were trying to convey visually in this book. And he and I have done a few events together, and he will always let the audience know that I handed him a 65-page list of sites to photograph throughout the city, and he ended up shooting over 19,000 separate photos that got distilled down into about 300 plus images, full color images that are original, and made the final cut for the book. And I think as I go through some of the images, just a sampling of those tonight, I think you'll see the talent and the eye that Schaeff has for historic architecture and placemaking in many ways in Los Angeles. And here he is on top of his SUV, and he took many photos looking down at sites from atop his truck. And here's the image he got across the LA basin, looking out behind the Hollywood sign, and many others that are just as wonderful throughout the book. So one of the key messages of the book, as I said, is really the power of historic preservation to transform communities. And as I said, we've seen this in downtown Los Angeles, in the historic core. Angelinos are really seeking out buildings, historic places with history, with beauty, with authenticity, that they add value as places to live, work, or play. And we've seen that in many other communities around the region, Old Pasadena and elsewhere. But in Los Angeles, we're increasingly seeing that the hottest real estate markets in the city are actually those that have the highest concentrations of historic buildings in many ways. And that's true on the residential side. It's true on the commercial development side as well. And I've tried to provide many examples throughout the book of how this transformation is taking place throughout the city. And I also wanted to infuse within the book my own continued sense of discovery and fascination about the city. I think for many authors, especially those who write fiction, the act of writing is an act of discovery, as you kind of discover your voice and your characters in the book. And for me, it was really more about channeling into the book the discovery, journey of discovery I've been on throughout my career in historic preservation. In many ways, having entree to see remarkable places that many members of the public don't get to see day to day. And that's what I love about my work, that I am constantly discovering places and communities. As long as I've been here, and I grew up here in LA, places I'm still discovering new places. And I want to share that in the book and share my excitement about many of those places in the book. As an example of that, I wanted to share the Garden of Oz, and I'll never forget the first time I got to visit this place. It's a secret garden in the Hollywood Hills, made possible by Gail Cotman, the property owner who worked with over 75 of her artist friends, including Beatrice Wood, to create this children's folk art and peace garden. She envisioned a Munchkin land with a symbolic yellow brick road and a throne for Dorothy, and tribute thrones to peacemakers from Rosa Parks to the Dalai Lama, or musicians from Duke Ellington to Ella Fitzgerald. And this is a site that's not generally open to the public. A couple hours a week at times it is open. Gail Cotman distributes keys to neighborhood residents and to artists to be able to experience this. She was very generous to allow Schaeff to photograph the site and share it with a wider audience in preserving Los Angeles. And I wanted to, like I said, kind of share some of these remarkable places, like the Garden of Oz, with a wider audience. And so I've had this bird's eye view from city government, working out of LA City Hall, and I hope that through the book that this will inspire your own sense of discovery and exploration about the city. But some of the key themes of the book really are about the power of historic preservation tools themselves to lead to transformation and positive outcomes for buildings and communities. And one of those is the designation of individual landmarks, what we call in Los Angeles historic cultural monuments. We have had a historic cultural monument program, a cultural heritage ordinance in Los Angeles dating back to 1962. We actually had one of the earliest landmark designation programs in the country before New York and Boston, San Francisco, and many cities you would have expected predated LA. And here's an example of a historic cultural monument helping to rescue a threatened historic building. It's an example of what's often called programmatic architecture, in which the form of the building reflects its use as a 1941 bar called Idle Hour. It was commissioned by a film technician for Universal Studios and was reopened in the 1970s after it had been a bar for many decades. It became a flamenco dinner theater, and that closed in the 1980s. And the flamenco dancer who was the star of those shows became like the Mother Goose nursery rhyme, the old woman who lived in a shoe. She became the old woman who lived in a whiskey barrel. Dolores Fernandez grew old living above her former flamenco theater until 2009, while the building deteriorated. And as her health deteriorated, she was moved into a rehabilitation facility. The building was threatened with demolition. And Chris Nichols, who's an editor at Los Angeles Magazine, longtime preservation activist, worked with the LA Conservancy to nominate this site as a historic cultural monument. And that allowed for when Dolores Fernandez passed away and the property was auctioned off, allowed for a preservation-minded buyer to step in, Bobby Green, who with his partners called the 1933 Group, they have restored a number of other historic buildings as bars. He and his partners spent about $2 million rehabilitating Idle Hour, preserving original stained glass, reclaiming ceiling planks for the bar's floors. They added a patio, and they moved to the patio another example of programmatic architecture, a reproduction of the 1928 Bulldog Cafe that had once sat on Washington Boulevard, a pipe-smoking dog. It had been on display, the replica, at the Peterson Automotive Museum. And Bobby Green and his partners moved that, so you have this juxtaposition of two examples of LA programmatic architecture made possible and rescued really through historic designation. Historic designation also can recognize sites of not only architectural significance, but social and cultural significance. And I've always noted that our landmarks are not called local landmarks, they're called historic-cultural monuments. So embedded within that name is the idea that this is about history and culture and social history. And the Black Cat Bar in Silver Lake is an example of that. And it was one of the earliest sites associated with the gay rights movement in this country. And in fact, again, there's always a perception that New York is on the cutting edge, and you know about the Stonewall riots in 1969, but you may not know that in 1967, there was a major there was a police raid of the LAPD on the Black Cat on New Year's Eve as the clock turned to midnight for 1967, and patrons were beaten. There was a melee out on the street, an example of police brutality, and it led to demonstrations at the site the following month that really predated Stonewall by about 2.5 years and really was the catalyst here in LA for the modern gay rights movement. And it led to a court appeal as well that went all the way to the US Supreme Court, asserting equal protection rights, really a first legal set of arguments around gay rights in this country that began in LA. And this site has been designated as a historic cultural monument, really reflecting not its architectural significance, but that cultural history in Los Angeles. So that's local designation of individual sites. We also have the tool, and Richard has already referenced it in the introduction, and you know it in Hancock Park and Windsor Square, HPOZs, Historic Preservation Overlay Zones, which have been a really important tool for preserving entire communities that have distinctive architectural character. And we now in Los Angeles have one of the nation's largest programs of local historic districts with 35 HPOZs. That encompasses over 21,000 separate properties in the city. And the book, chapter 2 of the book, as you can see, the opening spread here with our first HPOZ, the Angelino Heights HPOZ, designated in 1983, our finest collection of Victorian era architecture in the city. It really has been the HPOZs that have saved entire neighborhoods and led to dramatic revitalizations of many of those neighborhoods. And I have to apologize, speaking to a Hancock Park Windsor Square organization, that with 35 HPOZs citywide, I had to make some tough choices as to what would be the featured districts in the book. And I wanted to really highlight, in part, I greatly admire the Hancock Park and Windsor Square HPOZs, but I wanted to highlight something that makes LA's historic districts unique, which is the demographic and economic diversity of our historic districts. And in fact, there was a study last year prepared by an organization called Place Economics. It was commissioned by the LA Conservancy, that found that our historic districts, our HPOZs in LA, have a higher share of non-white population than the average share of non-white population throughout the rest of the city, and an economic level, a median income level that is below the income level of the rest of the city. And I think that surprised a lot of people, because I think many people have in their heads that all HPOZs have the kind of economic characteristics of Hancock Park and Windsor Square. And I wanted to really show that that was not the case. An example of that is the Jefferson Park HPOZ in South LA, not too far from USC. It's a community that today is about 50% Latino, about 35% African American. And the designation of this district as an HPOZ about 10 years ago has really helped to spark significant reinvestment and really knit together a very diverse community. And in fact, when this HPOZ went to City Council approval, City Planning Commission approval, it was a little different for those of you who were part of the Hancock Park or Windsor Square debates. You might remember that was not unanimous at the City Council and City Planning Commission, but it was a unanimous expression of support from this community, seeing historic preservation as an economic revitalization tool. There was not a single voice in opposition when that was considered. The Balboa Highlands neighborhood in Granada Hills illustrates that we have all time periods and all architectural styles that are part of our historic districts. Balboa Highlands in the north end of Granada Hills, it's one of two post-World War II HPOZs from 1962 to 1964. It's our only Eichler tract. Joseph Eichler built about 10,000 mid-century modernist homes in the Bay Area, and this is the only tract of its kind in the city of Los Angeles. And our HPOZ also show that, and Los Angeles, I think, shows for other cities, that historic preservation or historic district status and density are not mutually exclusive. And that same preservation positive study that I was citing also found that the density of residential residents per acre in our HPOZs is about 50% higher than the residential density in the rest of the city. And again, that surprises you if you're only thinking about Hancock Park and Windsor Square with large lots and single family homes, that might surprise you. But in fact, we have in many of our HPOZs kind of a more livable and walkable natural density, like this photo from the Lincoln Heights HPOZ. On the same block, you have a hip roof cottage on the left. In the center, a Spanish colonial revival triplex, so 3 units, and then a larger prairie craftsman style apartment building that all kind of fit together, even though they're all different styles and different intensities of use. It all kind of fits together within a historic district. I also wanted in the book to make sure that the reader doesn't forget that amidst all the beautiful photos and sites that we're showcasing, that preservation is ultimately about people, and that it's people who really make preservation possible through activism and commitment, and the people who give life to the historic buildings that we're featuring. And I was really pleased to be able to feature 10 what I call preservation profiles in the book to illustrate a few of the people who are making a difference, such as Michael Diaz on the left, who actually was the driving force with some of his neighbors pictured here to create that Lincoln Heights HPOZ that I just illustrated, or Kristen Hayashi, a longtime someone who actually not so long time, she was a PhD student in history at UC Riverside, decided to get involved with the Little Tokyo Historical Society and took on a historic cultural monument nomination for the first time on her own for a site called the Japanese Hospital in Boyle Heights that really speaks to Japanese immigrants in the 1920s, helping to create healthcare in their community at a time when immigrants were really being turned away from having access to healthcare. So non-traditional preservationists, as well as some profiles of preservation leaders such as Linda Dishman of the LA Conservancy, it was important to me to be able to showcase their stories in their own words in the book. And in doing so, I want to make clear that while my take on preservation in Los Angeles is generally a very positive one in terms of the impact that it's had in the city, it's not an entirely rosy picture. I don't want to be painting only a positive picture, and we have a lot more work to do in historic preservation in LA. And one of those areas where we have more work to do is in the area of equity and inclusion in historic preservation. And we've done a lot of work, and I'll give some nods to that as we go along, but it's still the case that only about 3% of our designated historic cultural monuments in the city reflect African-American heritage. Only about 6% reflect associations with our communities of color more generally. And I think we need to take a close look at why that is the case. One of the sites that has been designated as a historic cultural monument not too long ago was this small church, the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church on South Broadway in Southeast Los Angeles, just north of Watts. And it was designated for its role as the location of the recording of Amazing Grace, of Aretha Franklin's best-selling gospel album. And Sidney Pollack did a wonderful documentary film on the making of Amazing Grace. This was a building that was remodeled by Paul R. Williams, but really designated for its cultural significance and its importance in the history of music, locally and nationally. We recently launched with the Getty Conservation Institute through our Office of Historic Resources, a new Los Angeles African American Historic Places project in partnership with the Getty Conservation Institute to really begin to rectify that disparity and advance more historic cultural monument nominations like this, and look at all of our preservation processes and practices critically to address some of these equity concerns. But we have done a lot of work in this area, nevertheless, in Los Angeles that we are building upon. One of those is the creation of some preservation frameworks for, and really in partnership with many of our diverse communities of the city, what's often called a historic context statement, which is really developing themes, a framework with themes to help identify collections of places or neighborhoods that then reflect some of that research and some of the themes that have been developed. So we did develop and released in 2018 an African American history context for Los Angeles as part of our work on our citywide survey, Survey LA, that I'll be referencing in a moment. And that framework, that historic context, addressed a wide array of themes, from the civil rights movement to the history of the Black church in LA, and many others. But there's a story, of course, in Los Angeles of racially restrictive covenants and deed restrictions in many parts of the city. And it's a very ugly history that Black residents of Los Angeles could really only live in a tiny slice of the city for many decades. And a neighborhood that speaks to that history is the Sugar Hill neighborhood of West Adams. And this residence, which was the Hattie McDaniel residence. Hattie McDaniel was an Oscar-winning actress from her role in Gone with the Wind. And she joined forces with other Black homeowners to break down the racial covenants in Sugar Hill. Just in the years around World War II, they hired an attorney, Lauren Miller, to defend their right to own property in what had been an all-white neighborhood, and took a legal action that ultimately brought the issue of restrictive covenants all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and a ruling that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, finally in 1948, that began to slowly desegregate many of our neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So this is a home and a neighborhood that speaks to that history. Our Latino Los Angeles context has an array of themes, and of course a very important one is the role of Latinos in the visual arts in Los Angeles, the mural tradition of Los Angeles, which has shaped the visual identity of many of our city's public spaces. And a notable example of that is the Great Wall of Los Angeles. I encourage you to visit if you never have, in the San Fernando Valley and community of Valley Glen near Valley College. And it's the vision of Judy Baca and her nonprofit, the Social and Public Art Resource Center, SPARC. And it was a decade-long effort working with youth just about every summer between 1974 and 1984 to really put forward nothing short of an alternative social history of Los Angeles and California, addressing immigration, women's rights, the struggle for gay rights, and much more. Our Office of Historic Resources built upon the work that we did on this historic context that highlighted this site and decided we really needed to nominate this site for official historic status. And it now, as a result of our nomination, is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. We also worked in partnership with many communities to prepare 5 Asian Americans in Los Angeles historic context, supported by a National Park Service grant. One of those was a Japanese American context that helped to highlight important settlements of Japanese Americans throughout the city. We know about Little Tokyo, know a great deal about the Little Tokyo community. Often forgotten is the Sawtelle community of West Los Angeles, the westernmost Japanese American enclave. And it once had 26 Japanese American nurseries in the years before the Japanese American internment in World War II. Only a handful of those are left. Sawtelle is still a thriving Japanese American neighborhood with restaurants and businesses. But this one, the Yamaguchi Bonsai Nursery in West LA from 1934, is one of the few remaining nurseries of that period, and really still serves as an anchor for the Japanese American community of Sawtelle. So as I've already referenced, preservation has really led the way downtown in creating a downtown renaissance. It's been fueled by what we call adaptive reuse, converting historic buildings to new uses. This is a wonderful example of that. One of the great Art Deco buildings of the city, the Eastern Columbia building on Broadway. But it was the adaptive reuse ordinance passed in 1999 that cleared away some of the prior impediments to converting many of these buildings to housing, such as in the past, you would have had to provide more than 2 parking spaces for every housing unit within the building itself. And that's just not possible with many of our historic buildings. So that ordinance really set off a flood of projects. We had about 75 adaptive reuse projects in downtown LA in the first decade of the adaptive reuse ordinance. And that has really led to a new residential base downtown and a renaissance that has led to new restaurants and much other revitalization. One example reflects the early transit history of the city. That's the Pacific Electric building at 6th and Main. It was constructed by Henry Huntington, who we all know in terms of his history and the Huntington Library and Gardens in San Marino. He was the driving force behind the Pacific Electric railway system of the city. And we were a transit-oriented metropolis in the early 20th century. And this building, the Pacific Electric building, was the hub for all of the Pacific Electric system streetcar lines that came into downtown. It was considered LA's first skyscraper as well, being 9 stories high. And at the top floor, top 2 floors actually were the home to the Jonathan Club, one of the elite social clubs of the city, that now has its own building from the 1920s, but in its day it was at the top of the Pacific Electric building with a ballroom and smoking room, a library, and roof garden. The adaptive reuse ordinance allowed for the conversion of this building to 314 new residential units, the largest housing conversion project under the adaptive reuse ordinance, and where the Jonathan Club had been on the 9th floor ballroom. There are some penthouse units. The 8th floor library, the 8th floor rotunda was converted to a library for the new residents of the complex, complete with stained glass and marble. And you could see the beauty and the authenticity of our historic buildings. And I don't want to leave this building without mentioning Kohl's Pacific Electric Buffet, which has been part of this building since 1908. And along with Felipe's, however you prefer to pronounce it, further north in downtown, they had a rivalry and claim to inventing the French dip sandwich. So adaptive reuse, though, is not limited only to downtown or only to residential. It's really been driving many commercial ventures in the city. And when Google came looking at LA for a new kind of flagship building, a new home in Los Angeles, it wasn't looking at high-rise office buildings. It found a long vacant historic building, the Spruce Goose Hangar, that had been associated with Howard Hughes and Hughes Aircraft. Howard Hughes assembled his famous H-4 Hercules, the flying boat that famously only flew once within this hangar, and it had been vacant for decades, apparently, sometimes used for filming. But along with other former Hughes aircraft buildings that are nearby, this has really become what's now known as the Hercules campus, a center for tech companies like Google, YouTube, Yahoo, and others, really anchoring what's now known as LA's Silicon Beach. And again, it's historic buildings that are helping to make that possible. And historic buildings are also creating new affordable housing throughout the city. In South Los Angeles, a great example of that is the 28th Street YMCA project. And this is a very significant work of Paul R. Williams. I believe I saw with us tonight is Karen Hudson, Paul Williams' granddaughter, who honored to have her join us tonight, and really has been the keeper of the flame for Paul Williams' work and his archive, and significant author of works on Paul Williams. And this is one of his most notable works. It was a community center in South Los Angeles for decades, and began to deteriorate to some degree. Two nonprofits stepped in about 10 years ago and collaborated to convert this building to 24 units of housing for lower income residents. And then they added a 5-story building in a very contemporary style. It was Koenig Eisenberg architecture that did the addition. And it shows how historic buildings really can be differentiated from and be very contemporary and evolve in a way that can still be complementary to the historic structure. The historic building evolved quite a bit. The interior upper floors were converted to new dwelling units, new rooms. There had been a swimming pool, though, on the ground floor that was filled in. You see that the lower left, and it became the common room and kitchen. But there's an outer tile edge that you can see to the right of that photo that defines the outline of the pool where that had been. And the rest of the original tile remains intact underneath, making this reversible theoretically if we wanted to restore that someday. But it kind of shows the evolution of this space and the history of the space as a historic building, but evolving it for contemporary uses and affordable housing needs moving forward. So the last section of my presentation, I wanted to share that a large part of the book captures the work of Survey LA, which was completed in 2017, the largest and most ambitious citywide survey project in the nation, really a partnership between the City of Los Angeles and the J. Paul Getty Trust. And when I speak about the survey, I begin with this map to show the challenge before us. This is the map of the outline of the City of Los Angeles. It's 470 square miles, with 8 of the largest cities in the country fitting within, with a lot of room to spare. And that was the task before us for Survey LA. And we worked in partnership with the Getty, which provided funding, and we're able to contract with historic preservation consultants to go out in the field, literally go down every street of the city. This was anchored in a very robust public participation program, tapping into the collective knowledge of Angelenos about places that matter to them, and particularly sites of social and cultural significance that might not be so obvious visually. And we created new technological tools to enable teams to go out in the field and capture this with a wizard, a multi-step process, and record all of this digitally. And this has all led to having this information available online through a website called Historic Places LA, historicplacesla.org, as a resource to guide good planning in the city, because we can only really plan the future of our city if we know what and where our historic resources are in the first place, to figure out where we can accommodate more intense development and what areas we want to preserve. And so a significant portion of the book features what I called Survey LA discoveries, some of the hidden gems from that were picked up in the survey, really in every community of the city. It was important to me that every community be equally represented, that Los Angeles is not just downtown or Hollywood or Venice, the communities that many of us know, but that they're San Pedro or Arleta and Pacoima and Mar Vista and many others. Every community in the city has rich architectural heritage and rich social and cultural history. And so the Survey LA discoveries capture some of that. I'm going to give you just a very quick sampling of a cross-section of what's found through the survey that we capture in the book and Survey LA Discoveries. One example in the Boyle Heights community is the Q Sing Chan residence in Boyle Heights, 1898 Queen Anne home that's quite lovely architecturally, but even more significant as the home to one of the few Chinese Americans to be able to own property in this city and in Boyle Heights in the late 19th century during a period of Chinese exclusion and anti-immigration settlement. This was a court interpreter from China who came to the US and became the first Methodist minister of Chinese descent in the United States, and his home is still intact in Boyle Heights. There's some wonderful architectural oddities sprinkled throughout the book and throughout our survey. The high tower elevator and garages in the Hollywood Hills, a little taste of Europe in the Hollywood Hills, a campanile in the Alta Loma development of Hollywood that provided access. This was actually an elevator tower providing access to homes through an elevator system connecting to a network of pedestrian stairways and walkways nearby. In the West San Fernando Valley, this exuberant church, the Epiphany Lutheran Church, this soaring A-frame chapel conveying kind of googie architecture influences, mid-century modernism in a religious structure. And other churches that were less significant architecturally, but had, again, kind of the social and cultural significance, such as this one in Pacoima in the Northeast Valley from 1957, Calvary Baptist. Very important for its association with the civil rights movement in the San Fernando Valley and the family, the Brodus family, Hillary T. Brodus, the Reverend here, and some of his other family members and descendants who really helped break down the San Fernando Valley's racially restrictive covenants and segregation. And this was a site of civil rights rallies and major community events, very important to the Pacoima community. Not too far down the road in the community of Sun Valley, not a part of the Northeast Valley you might expect looking for historic resources, but there's this wonderful Pink Motel and Cadillac Jacks, one of the few remaining examples of a roadside motel and coffee shop of its era in the late 1940s. And this is on San Fernando Road. And why would you find a motel and coffee shop like this on San Fernando Road in the 1940s? Well, this was Highway 99, connecting to Northern California, communities such as Fresno and other communities to the north before Interstate 5 was built. And so this was really the kind of gateway into Los Angeles in the north. And you had this roadside architecture. Most of it's gone, but some of the examples still remain. And this is a property that's today used mostly for filming. Heading to the west side, there's this house, Orilla Kempton residence. And this is a home, kind of a craftsman home with transitional craftsman Queen Anne home from 1906. And there are homes like this in other parts of the central city area, but this is one of the few examples of its type on the west side of Los Angeles. This is on atop Mar Vista Hill and located in what was Los Angeles's first gated community, the oldest remaining residence in Mar Vista from 1906. So I have to put in some examples closer to you in Hancock Park and Windsor Square. We didn't resurvey Hancock Park and Windsor Square and Survey LA because they were already HPOZs. So if you feel there's an omission there as well, that's why, because they already had historic designation. But there are some examples nearby that did get picked up in the survey and included in the book. One of them is this post-war house, which is post-war house or House of Tomorrow, a single family home on Wilshire Boulevard, 4950 Wilshire from 1946. And it was developed by Fritz Burns, a very prominent developer of his time, and designed by architects Werdeman and Beckett. And it was a highly publicized model home for what post-war living would be all about. It was showcased in House Beautiful magazine in 1946, and more than 1 million people came through this house to tour it in 1946 and 1947. It showcased new technologies like electric garbage disposals and two-way intercoms and all the newfangled technology for a home. And it remains intact. It's had a number of different uses. It was an art school most recently. I think it's been, some of you might know, I think it was for lease earlier this year, but is a very significant house and certainly one of the few single family houses on the Wilshire Boulevard corridor. Another example, this is west of Crescent Heights, sort of near about 4th Street, 5th Street, and It's on Drexel, the Raymond Chandler House, a fairly modest house. But this was the home of the novelist and screenwriter Raymond Chandler during this pivotal time of his career when he became a screenwriter for Paramount Pictures and made his debut in screenwriting and adapted other literary works such as Double Indemnity. This is where he lived, and his home in this community is still intact. In other cases, very modest structures have sort of hidden significance. And you look at this building and it seems fairly unremarkable. It was built in 1922 in the community of Del Rey, but it's the only remnant building from what had been the Barnes City Wild Animal Circus and Zoo. This was quite a place in its heyday in the 1920s. It was a zoo with over 4,000 animals, and then a traveling circus that went on the road and was based here. And actually, it was its own incorporated city called Barnes City for several years in the 1920s before it later got absorbed into the city of Los Angeles. So this is the one remnant of the city of Barnes City, now within the community of Del Rey in LA. And then a final few examples, the Vermont Knolls neighborhood, and this is an example of what could be a future HPOZ, and it's a neighborhood that's working toward HPOZ or other historic district status. It's adjacent to what had been the original Pepperdine University campus in South LA. And you see this wonderful photo that Schaaf took with this kind of consistency of massing, even though you have different colors, different forms, this really visually pleasing array of forms and styles, and a community I think we'd like to see achieve historic district status. Another neighborhood not too far away from this is the Goodyear Gardens neighborhood with 49 single-family homes, again, fairly modest homes built in 1920. And what's significant here is that these were built as worker housing. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company had an industrial plant not too far away from this on Central Avenue and actually built a neighborhood, a community of homes for their workers. And we see this in many other parts of the country. We have very few examples of worker housing by an industrial conglomerate like Goodyear. This is still intact, and the identification of some of these homes in the survey have led to the individual designation of several of them as historic cultural monuments. And finally, a couple of sites that represent what I think of as layers of change, layers of history in the city, and which is one of the things that I find so fascinating about LA. And so you have here the American Hotel, which was actually originally called the Canadian Hotel because its first manager was Canadian. It's in the former downtown industrial district, what we now know of as the Arts District of LA, and was a very early LA hotel building. When it was first built, it was actually a first-class hotel for African Americans, largely Pullman car porters who worked out of some of the nearby railroad stations. It changed over the years, and by the 1970s, the hotel became more notable as the site of Al's Bar, which had legendary status as the home of the punk rock scene in the 1970s and 80s, and then the grunge rock scene of the 1990s. So you have from Pullman car porters to punk and grunge rock, a site that really has evolved and served multiple purposes over its history within an arts district that continues to evolve and change. And then finally, what this neighborhood, which we call the Crenshaw-Sanon Historic District, identified in Survey LA, and it was identified as significant for its association with Japanese Americans who settled in this neighborhood in the years after the Japanese American internment following World War II. And this community changed subsequently. It's been largely an African American neighborhood, continues to evolve demographically, but it retains, as you can see, these design features and particularly landscaping such as bonsai that evoke the Japanese American residents who are no longer so present physically in the neighborhood, but you can see this visual representation of the layers of history of Los Angeles. And that's really the Los Angeles, again, that I wanted to share through this book, an LA with layers of history and great complexity. And often we look at LA from afar atop the Griffith Observatory, or we contemplate it from afar. And it looks sprawling and often beautiful, perhaps as you see the twinkling lights, but we forget about kind of the fine-grained histories, the fine grain that makes up the city. And I hope that preserving Los Angeles and the talk and the book, which I hope you'll follow up and read, makes Los Angeles more more legible to you, these layers of history more legible, and gives greater meaning to Los Angeles and its history and all these communities, and you start to see Los Angeles in a very different way as a result. So with that, I'm happy to wrap up and open it up for Q&A.
Wow, that was really good, Ken. Something tells me you've done this before because it's so good. Oh God, these were some great images there. All right, let's open it up to some Q&A here. Who has a question for Mr. Bernstein?
Please unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question.
Oh, well, I raised my hand, but I'll just speak.
Hi, Patty.
Lombard,
Hey,
how are you?
Oh, it's so great. I have to say, I have heard this before, but I always learn something. Like, I didn't really appreciate how cool that little property is on Wilshire that we drive by at 50 miles an hour. I'm just wondering, now that you've done this a few times and you've been talking about the value of preservation, and there's this still so much pressure to densify, and you have the Hollywood community plan. I'm just wondering if you feel like you're getting through. Are you making headway, or should we feel more hopeful? Because your message is so good.
Well, I have to say, I can't speak to all the ways in which the book may be used and all that's happening politically at the local level or at the state level, which goes way beyond forces that I can impact to some degree, but it goes way beyond what I affect day to day. But I will say that the reaction to the book, which has been out for a few months, has been really gratifying, and I've been hearing that from many, both kind of preaching to the choir at times, hearing from longtime committed preservationists, but a lot of people who really told me that they hadn't contemplated preservation in this way, and the kind of positive effects that preservation has had around Los Angeles, and that it really has opened their eyes. I can't speak to the fact whether all the Sacramento politicians are reading it, or whether it's changing the debate up there around some of the state legislation that has a significant impact on what we can and can't regulate at the local level in Los Angeles. But I will say that from the reaction I've been getting from traditional preservationists and many people who never thought of themselves as preservationists but are engaged in urban affairs in various ways, or advocacy at their community level, I think the message seems to be resonating, and people seem to be responding to it. So that's been very gratifying, just from the anecdotal reactions I've been getting.
It's wonderful. Where is that little house? I was so intrigued by that little house. I have the address. I have to pass it. Where is
the post-war house?
Yeah, well, like Wilshire.
Yeah, the address is 4950 Wilshire. So is that near Highland? I'm trying to think. It's close to Highland, I think.
Highland is Wilshire. I know exactly where it is. Okay, yes, I know where it is. All right. It was a school a little while ago.
Yes.
I know where exactly.
Didn't they used to have reindeer on the top of the roof?
I think they did for a little bit there. It's right. Yeah, there's a school there. Wow, nice.
Judy, 12 Max.
Yes, I'm here. Question. For example, new construction, Olympic and Manhattan Place near Olympic and Western is going to have a big giant 7-story box put up. There seem to be no architectural guidelines, and anyone on these building neighborhood input committees have not much to say about the architecture. And I'd like to see if the city has put in place or can put in place some architectural guidelines so that we don't get a bunch of boxes everywhere. Thank you.
No, thanks for the comment and the question. I don't know the specifics of that project, so I can't speak to whether it went through, there are certain types of projects that are what we call by right projects that don't require any type of planning approvals or other reviews. I will say, and Richard mentioned in his introduction, that the other hat I wear within LA City Planning is I head a small team called the Urban Design Studio, which is really working on design issues, both design review and then the kind of the public realm, how we enhance the quality and character of design and public space in the city. And one thing that we prioritized and got through actually just prior to some state legislation that took effect last year that now makes it almost impossible to adopt new design guidelines. We did at the end of 2019 revise and have the City Planning Commission adopt a set of citywide design guidelines that are being used throughout the city for whenever there is a project that requires any type of discretionary action by city planning. Even the transit-oriented communities incentive program that has been created as a result of the ballot measure, Measure J, several years ago, that was approved by the voters, that created this incentive program as part of the ballot measure that was mandated on us. When we created those guidelines, we did make clear that even if a project is taking advantage of those incentives to create essentially greater density with affordable units near transit, they are still subject to applicable design guidelines. So we do use the citywide design guidelines even for those projects. But I think one of the things the book tries to make clear is that historic preservation tools do give communities additional ability to do design review, and I think it's why communities like Hancock Park or Windsor Square, some of your neighboring communities, Wilshire Park, Windsor Village, Miracle Mile North, and others look different and have a consistency and a cohesiveness that is different from those areas that don't have historic designation. That is not an accident. Now, obviously, the entire city can't be an HPOZ. We don't want to, kind of impose historic districts throughout the city. And as I mentioned, there's about 21,000 properties in HPOZs. That's still only about 2.5% of our city parcels, citywide. So most of the city does not have historic preservation protections. But I think the book really tries to illustrate how historic preservation tools really lead to enhanced design outcomes, and you don't get, or it's less likely that you will get incompatible new development and a quality and character that really is not reflective of the essence of those communities. So
the transit-oriented communities, which gives you Olympic, Western Vermont, all these streets are now polluted with giant ugly boxes right up to the curb, no awnings. They are going to be trash in just a few years. And I don't think the neighborhoods who have anything to say know that there may be these guidelines you just talked about in certain areas. But every place in the main city is connected closely to a bus or a metro line, particularly the buses on the main streets. So yeah. All of our historic neighborhoods adjoining these are getting really destroyed by these gigantic messes. And I'm quite upset by that. Right. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all upset when we see something ugly popping up, and it's been happening for many years, and it's not just now. What other questions do we have? Oh, Juanita Kemp.
I don't have a question, but an appreciation of the cover of that book, because I worked in the building next to the Orpheum for a long time and didn't realize what a wonderful area I was working in. And of course, I've always appreciated the Eastern Columbia building, and I'm so happy that that was all restored and it's still there. And
thank you.
Yeah, and the United Artists building. Of course, it took a lot of money to restore that Orpheum, and I know who the people are that did that. That was several millions of dollars. And the other theaters that are being restored, and I can't wait to go downtown and see what they did to the May Company building, and then the Tower Theater.
I was about to say,
yes, that's the Apple building. I've got to go down and see all those now that it's been so long since I've worked down there.
No, thank you. I wanted to put Broadway, Broadway has a special place in my heart. A dozen remarkable movie palaces in a 6-block stretch of Broadway, this incredible urban commercial district that is so significant in so many ways to LA. So I wanted, again, in kind of exploding the myths of Los Angeles, I wanted to show at least the rest of the country that we do have this intensely urban downtown with remarkable architecture, and Sheikh's photo is beautiful. But I did want to take note of, in particular, the Tower Theater, which just reopened last month. Apple and our office worked very closely with Apple. It was a hush-hush project for a long time because Apple didn't want to make their identity known when they began discussing the project with the city and with the owners of the theater. But that is now their flagship Apple store for Los Angeles in one of the remarkable movie palaces of downtown. And it's very exciting, and they'll be doing more than they normally would at an Apple store, really making that, they see that as almost a community center within the historic theater, doing special programming of many types. And we're really pleased with the quality of the rehabilitation work that was done for one of LA's historic theaters.
So Ken, I was just there a few days ago to take a battery in for service, and I purposely went there as opposed to the Grove, and it was so adorable. The tech guy, who's the Genius Bar guy, the genius at the Genius Bar, wanted me. He said to me, "Now, do you know much about this building?" And I was like, "Well, a little tiny bit." And he said, "Well, let me tell you about it." So
that's great. I didn't know that they were doing that. I'm glad they're well.
Yeah.
They're well informed. That's good.
Yeah, it was clear that they had educated their staff, and then on the lower level, when you do go, you have to see it, Juanita. They have a little exhibit of sort of before and after pictures. They're very proud of it, and I was really impressed to see that they'd educated the staff as well. So that was kind of a cool thing. You did your job, yay.
Where did you park when you were down there? Because there's a lack of parking.
Well, so we spent $10 and parked in one of the world's worst parking garages. Really, I would recommend going in a very small car. It's one of those crazy lot. It was really close by, though. It was just 2 doors up. We went on a Saturday afternoon. My husband and I went, and it's those funny buildings, right? That they have so many columns in them that it's impossible to make them into garages, but they somehow do. And I don't know, Ken, you probably know those buildings better than anybody. They're not great garages, but there is parking.
The best really is Pershing Square, I think, for parking. And it's walkable. It's not that far.
Yeah, I always get lost though, so that seemed far. It's like start where I need to go and then park nearby.
Well, just find the Biltmore Hotel and go across the street and park there.
Right.
What other questions do we have for Ken? Marlene? No? We might not have any more questions, Ken.
Well, dare we ask you what your next project is, sir?
There we go. Yes. Good question.
That's a great question. I don't know if I yet have another book in me. I said a lot of what I wanted to say in this book, and in many ways it kind of encapsulates a lot of what I've worked on over the last couple of decades. But I don't know. I'll think about that. But right now I don't have another book plan. I have plenty of other projects within city government. I'm still doing my thing. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of work still to do in the city. That's unfinished business. So plenty keeping me busy.
Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do at the design studio? Like, who is taking advantage of that, and how can we learn more about that when the neighborhood talks to developers and people like that, and they seem to not know how to design a building?
Well, the Urban Design Studio is really meant to be a resource both for project applicants and to other staff within our department. And so we do work with applicants and do project design reviews, and the essence of the citywide design guidelines that we have, we really try to kind of distill down what are the city's design expectations for projects into 10 guidelines and kind of 3 larger principles kind of what we called pedestrian first design, which we are putting pedestrians first, and designing not so much for the automobile, but for walkability and how you traverse and access a site. What we call 360-degree design, which is has a couple of meanings. One is really that all sides of a building matter and should be well designed, and but also that buildings should be in conversation with their neighbors on all sides, and that the relationship of a new project with its neighbors in all directions is worthy of careful design and consideration. And then finally, climate adapted design, really looking at the uniqueness of the Southern California Mediterranean influenced climate, but also steps that building design can take to minimize the impacts of climate change, kind of mitigate the energy use and the climate impact of a building. So, trying to distill that down in a way that is understandable both to architects and developers and community members, that these are the key expectations that we have for projects that are going through some type of discretionary review with the city. And we work both internally with our own planning staff in doing those design reviews, as well as meeting directly with project applicants. And we do quite a bit of work as well with other city departments, like I said, on public space, and often that's with our Bureau of Engineering, Department of Transportation, Recreation and Parks, and others. A lot of city departments have influence over what our streets look like and what public space, the quality and character of public space. And so the Urban Design Studio is kind of that key point of interface between the city planning, and those other agencies.
Nice. Brett Parsons, do you have any questions? I see you are here. Okay. Ken, that was spectacular. I'm so glad that I got you to do this, because it was so good, and I can't wait to get this book. So I want to thank you for this great presentation. We got in the chat, someone's thanking you for this great presentation as well. So if there's no other questions, I think we'll wrap it up, and appreciate that you've done this, and it's a beautiful book, and I can't wait to get it.
Thank you. I don't know if the link to it was shared, or if it will be afterwards. Hopefully, I don't know. I'm just looking at the chat now, but
we have it on our website. Actually, when you buy the tickets, you can get it there.
Oh, fantastic! Great.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you, and again, just want to thank all of you for your own commitment to history and architecture and community all year long.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. And we'll just wrap this up and see you next month. All right.